She hid a bounty on her head. Rancher paid it off before their wedding night. The deed was in my left hand, and the coffee was cold by the time she told me. That's how I remember it. Not the words first, the coffee. I'd poured it maybe 10 minutes before and forgot it, the way you do when the books don't balance and you're staring at a number that won't move. The mug sat there on the corner of the desk going cold and I didn't touch it. And then she knocked twice on the office door, came in without waiting on an answer, and stood there with her hands clasped in front of her like she was fixing to say grace at a table that had no food on it. Her name was Cora Dunst. She'd been on the Broken Bow 6 weeks. She was meant to be there through the spring, a housekeeper, a cook help with the accounts when the foreman's eyes gave out on him, which they were doing more and more. I'd found her through a woman in Laredo who placed domestics. References were good. Her handwriting on the letters was careful and even. She showed up on the stage with one trunk and a carpet bag and a way of looking at things, at the land, at the cattle moving on the far slope, like she was memorizing it for later. I hadn't asked myself why. She said, "Mr. Cord, I have to tell you something before someone else does." I set the deed down. She said a name, a man's name, Rufus Aldine. She said it the way you say the name of a sickness, flat, like the word itself has weight, and you want to set it down quick and step back from it. She said Aldine was a man she'd been married to, briefly, in Abilene 3 years prior. She said he was a man who moved money that wasn't his. She said there was a federal warrant for her in connection with those movements, as a co-conspirator, though she hadn't known what she was signing when he put papers in front of her, and that the warrant had been sold to a bounty concern out of San Antonio. She said the figure was $400. Then she stopped. I sat there. Outside, one of the hands was working a horse in the near pen. I could hear it, the rhythm of hooves on packed dirt, the occasional voice, patient and low. Ordinary afternoon sounds. And here in my office, this woman standing with her hands clasped and her face completely still, like she'd rehearsed the telling so many times it had gone past fear and come out the other side into something I didn't have a word for. I said, "How long have you known this was following you?" She said, "Since Laredo, a man asked about me at the hotel. The woman who placed me, she told him nothing, but I knew then." I said, "And you came here anyway?" She said, "I needed the work. I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought I had more time than I had." "What's changed?" "Yesterday, one of your hands came back from Sandoval saying a man had been asking questions in town. Description matched." I picked up the coffee. It was cold. I drank it anyway. What I knew about Rufus Aldine by nightfall of that same day could fill 1 page of a small notebook. I sent Tuck Hennessy into Sandoval on a horse that could move, with instructions to find out everything the saloons knew. Because saloons know everything eventually, that's what they're for. He was back by 9 o'clock with the outlines of it. Aldine had run a land scheme out of Abilene and then a second one out of Dodge. Moving money, holding deeds in false names, collecting on transactions that had no real property behind them. By the time the Federals came in, he was gone, left a young wife behind with her name on 2 of the instruments. The wife was Cora. She'd been 22 and apparently believed he was a land broker, which he was, in the technical sense that a coyote is technically a dog. The warrant named her as a co-conspirator. The Federals would have known better on a slow day, but the man running the investigation had pressure on him to show progress, and a name on a document was progress. She was never charged directly. The warrant was civil adjacent, connected to the recovery of funds. Messy law. The kind of messy law that a bounty concern can buy cheap and collect on because the paperwork says what it says and nobody's paid to read it carefully. $400. The man in Sandoval had shown the paper around. His name was Orrin Vess. He worked for a concern called Hallard Recovery out of San Antonio, 3 men, sometimes 4, who moved through West Texas picking up civil warrants and cashing them. Legitimate, more or less. The law didn't much care either way. Tuck said Vess had a partner with him, maybe 2. They were staying at the Duggan Hotel. They'd been asking which ranches lay north of town, how far out, whether the roads washed out in spring. I thanked Tuck, gave him a drink from the bottle I kept in the desk, and told him to say nothing to the other hands tonight. Then I sat there in my office a good while longer. Here is what I want to be clear about, because I've told pieces of this to a few men over the years, and the telling always goes sideways at this point. They assume I had some kind of feeling for her already, that this was about some soft thing that had gotten into me in 6 weeks and made me foolish. That's not what it was. Or it's not only what it was, and the only part isn't the important part. The broken bow was mine. I'd built it from 160 acres of scrubland after the war, bought more when I could, lost some, bought more again. I had 4 full-time hands, 2 part-time through the summer, a cook/bookkeeper who was going blind, and a spread that was finally starting to do what I'd always meant it to do. I was 51 years old. I had never had a woman on the property, not as staff, not any other way, since my wife died in '71 of a fever that came in fast and left nothing to be done about it. I did not bring Cora Dunst out here because I was looking for something. I brought her because Hennessy's eyes were going and the accounts were getting away from him, and I needed someone who could read a column of figures without squinting. But she had been here 6 weeks, and in 6 weeks I had formed some opinions. She worked without being watched. That's the first thing. Half the hired help I'd had in 30 years needed the sense they were being observed or they'd find a reason to do half a job. She didn't. She'd be at the books at 6 in the morning with the lamp lit before anyone else was up, and she'd still be there at 8 at night if there was a discrepancy she hadn't found the bottom of yet. She cooked without complaint. She handled Hennessy's failing eyes with patience I didn't expect, reading things aloud to him without condescension, finding ways to get the information where it needed to go. She didn't talk much. When she did, she said something. I'd watched her a few times from a distance, which is how you learn about a person without them performing for you. Seen her stand at the fence of the horse pen in the evenings just watching, not trying to touch them, not romanticizing them, just watching the way a person watches something they respect. Seen her deal with a hand who spoke to her sideways, not with complaint, not with drama, just a look and 2 words that made him reset and choose differently. Seen her one morning find a crack in the water barrel and fix it herself with a piece of scrap wood, and a mallet rather than come, find me with a problem. So when she stood in my office with her hands clasped and told me what she told me, the first thing I felt was not what you might think. It was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition. Like a piece of a picture I'd been looking at without knowing I was looking at it had finally turned over and showed the other side. She'd been running something, and she'd been running it quietly without letting it touch her work or her dignity because she didn't have any other way to live. That told me more about who she was than 6 months of ordinary conduct would have. The second thing I felt, and this is the part that mattered, was that it wasn't right. A woman who'd been tricked by a bad man into putting her name on his paper, who'd been left holding his debt while he walked away clean, who'd worked her way out to the edge of West Texas trying to stay ahead of something she didn't deserve. That wasn't a story that ought to end with Orrin Vess, and his partners dragging her back to San Antonio in exchange for $400. Not off my land. I went to her room at the back of the house around 10 o'clock. Knocked. She opened the door in her work clothes. She hadn't undressed, hadn't planned on sleeping. The room was neat. The trunk was in the corner closed and latched. She'd been ready to run if the word came that she needed to. I said, I want to know the number exactly. She said, $420. That's the warrant face. The concern takes a percentage. I said, do you have documentation? The original instrument, the warrant, whatever was filed. She went to the trunk, opened it, pulled out a flat leather folder and handed it to me without a word. I took it to my office and read it for an hour. The legal language was tangled, the way that kind of document always is, designed to sound more certain than it was. But the core of it was recoverable. The warrant had been issued on the basis of her name appearing on 2 instruments. It didn't allege anything more than that. It didn't name a criminal act with any specificity. It was the kind of thing that gets signed by a clerk on a bad afternoon, and then sold to a recovery concern before anyone looks at it hard. There was a path through it, not a short path, but a path. I sat there until about midnight making calculations, which is something I'm good at. I have always been good at the math of a situation, looking at what's there, what it costs, what the alternatives are, and finding the number. It's what let me build the broken bow from nothing and keep it when other men were losing theirs. The math here was this. Paying the warrant face got Vess off the land and got Cora out of the civil recovery system. $420. That was money I had barely if I moved some things around. After that, there was a lawyer in El Paso named Beaumont who had handled federal land disputes, not cheap but known to be thorough, who I believed could file a petition challenging the warrant on the grounds that the co-conspirator designation was not supported by evidence of intent or knowledge. That would take time. Money. There was no guarantee. But the alternative was doing nothing, and doing nothing wasn't available to me. I went back to her room, knocked again. She was still up, still dressed. She opened the door and looked at me and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. I said, I'm going into Sandoval tomorrow morning. I'm going to meet with Vess. I'm going to pay the warrant face. The look on her face was not gratitude, not right away. It was something harder to read, something that looked almost like pain. She said, that's your operating money. I said, some of it. She said, Mr. Cord. I said, the arrangement would be a loan against future wages. We can draw up the terms tonight if you want. She stood there a long moment. Outside, the wind was moving across the flat, not a storm wind, just the plain breathing. The lamp made a small sound, the way they do when the wick needs trimming. She said, why? And I said the true thing. I said, because you've been working for me in good faith for 6 weeks, and what happened to you wasn't your fault, and I'm not interested in watching a recovery concern take you off this property over a dead man's bad paper. She looked at me for a long time after that. Not like she was deciding whether to believe me. More like she was letting herself believe me, which is a different thing and sometimes harder. I went to Sandoval alone, which Tuck argued with me about. I didn't want a show of hands behind me because a show of hands makes the other side feel cornered, and a cornered man makes bad decisions. I wanted it clean. Vess was at the Duggan Hotel dining room having breakfast when I walked in. I knew him from the description Tuck had brought back, a trim man, middle 40s, with the precise and watchful manner of someone who moves through other people's disasters for a living. He had a partner at the same table, younger, who kept his hand close to his hip. I sat down across from him without being invited. He said, this seat's taken. I said, my name is August Cord. I run the Broken Bow north of here. I believe you've been making inquiries about a woman on my property. He looked at me, the younger man looked at me. Vess said, Cora Dunst, civil warrant, she's an employee of yours. I said, she is. He said, then you know she's subject to recovery under. I put the leather folder on the table. He looked at it, opened it, read it in the careful way of a man who reads documents for money, closed it, looked at me. I said the warrant was issued on thin basis and you know it. Name on a document. No evidence of intent, no direct involvement, one federal clerk's signature on a bad afternoon. You'd get her to San Antonio and spend more in legal costs than you'd collect, assuming the recovery even completes. Meanwhile, I've got a lawyer in El Paso who's filed challenges to 5 documents like this in the past 2 years. I watched him calculate. That's what men like Vess do, they calculate. They're not cruel for the love of it, they're businessmen in a grim business, and they respond to numbers. I said, I'll pay you the face of the warrant, today, in exchange for the original instrument, a signed release of claim, and your firm's agreement to mark the matter closed. He said, the face is $420. I said, I know what the face is. I also know your percentage runs about 30, which means your profit on $420 is around $120, and your cost in time and travel is already against that. You take what I'm offering, you walk out with a margin, and you haven't had to set foot on my property. He looked at me for a long time. He said, you're paying this out of your own pocket. I said, that's between me and my books. He said, she know you're here. I said, she does. He sat back, looked at the folder again, looked at his partner who gave him nothing, looked back at me. He said, you bring the money. I said, I brought it. It took 40 minutes to complete. A receipt, a release, his signature and his partner's, mine, the original instrument. The folder with everything in it, back in my hands. I rode back to the Broken Bow with the folder in my saddlebag, and the weight of $420 no longer in my operating account. The sky was the particular color it gets in West Texas around mid-morning, not blue exactly, more like white that hasn't committed, and the road was empty, and the horse moved easy under me. I wasn't thinking about what I'd done. That wasn't useful. I was thinking about the El Paso lawyer, Beaumont. I'd need to write to him this week, get him the documentation, lay out the case. The challenge wouldn't be fast and it wouldn't be free, but it needed to be filed while the warrant was still recoverable, before someone else at Hallard Recovery thought to assign it again. Vess could release his claim, and another man in the same concern. could still hold paper if the warrant wasn't formally discharged. The work was not finished, it had just changed shape. She was at the books when I got back. The office door was open and she was at the desk with the ledger flat in front of her and a pen in her hand, working. She looked up when I came in. I put the folder on the desk. She opened it, read through it, the release, the receipt, the original instrument, the signatures. She read it twice, closed it. She said, "He took the offer." I said, "He took it." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You laid out the legal argument before you offered him money. Soften the position before the number. Makes the number feel like a relief rather than a ceiling." She looked at me, not a short look. She said, "Where'd you learn that?" I said, 30 years of buying land from men who didn't want to sell." She almost smiled, not quite, something around the eyes. She said, "The warrant's not discharged. Vess releasing his claim doesn't close it." I said, "No, I'm writing to a lawyer in El Paso this week. Fellow named Beaumont. He's handled these challenges before." She said, "That's more money." I said, "Yes." She said, "August." It was the first time she'd used my given name. She said it plain, not soft, not loaded with anything she was afraid to carry, just my name. "I need you to understand that I intend to repay every dollar of this, not as gratitude, as debt. Terms agreed, installments, whatever structure you think is right. I'm not a person who takes and doesn't account for it." I said, "I know that. That's not why I did it." She said, "Why then?" I said, "I already told you last night." She said, "Tell me again." I looked at her. The window behind the desk caught the midday light and threw it across the ledger, across her hands, across the pen she was still holding. She sat straight in the chair the way she always sat. She wasn't performing anything. She was just looking at me and asking a real question and waiting for a real answer. I said, "You're good at this work. You're honest. You got handed something that wasn't yours to carry and you carried it anyway alone for 3 years without letting it make you small. I don't have a great deal of use for doing nothing when doing something is available." She held that. Then she said quietly, "Most men in your position, they'd have let Vess take me, told themselves it wasn't their trouble." I said, "Most men." She nodded, slow, and there was something in her face then, not sentiment, not softness, something older and more real than that, like a person who has been braced for a long time and has just very carefully let a fraction of the brace go. The letter to Beaumont went out that Friday. He wrote back inside 2 weeks, faster than I'd expected, and his letter was careful and precise. He'd seen this pattern before, the co-conspirator designation thrown onto a spouse with no evidence of knowledge or intent, used as leverage in civil recovery rather than genuine prosecution. He thought the challenge had merit. He wanted $50 to review the full documentation and another $250 if he filed. He laid out what he'd need, how long it would likely take, what the probable outcomes were. He did not promise anything he wasn't sure of. I liked him immediately. I sent the documentation and the $50. In the meantime, life on the Broken Bow proceeded. It has a way of doing that. The land doesn't wait on your personal business. There were fences down in the south pasture after a storm came through in early March, cattle to move before the river rose, the usual maintenance of a working spread. I was up at 5 most mornings and rarely still before 9 at night. Cora kept pace with it. That was the thing I noticed most about her in those weeks. She didn't treat the trouble as something that had paused the life. She worked. She kept the books tight. She cooked without complaint. She found problems before they became problems, and handled them without needing to make a production of the handling. One evening about 3 weeks after Sandoval, I came in from the pasture to find her at the kitchen table with Hennessy, reading him a survey report. He needed to know the property lines for something he was sorting out with a neighboring ranch, and his eyes were fully given up on him by then for fine print. She was reading it to him phrase by phrase, stopping to let him ask questions, not rushing, patient in the way of someone who genuinely didn't mind the time it took. I stood in the doorway a moment. They didn't see me. I didn't announce myself. I just stood there in the dark of the hall watching the lamp on the table and listening to her voice go through the survey lines, flat, technical, careful, and Hennessy's voice asking his slow questions, and the sound of the house being a working house with someone in it who knew how to be in a house. I went to bed not long after that. In the morning I was up before she was, which was unusual. I made the coffee. When she came into the kitchen and saw that, She stopped for a second, just a second, and then she poured herself a cup and sat down at the table and picked up the accounts she'd been working on the night before, and we were a half hour into the morning before either of us spoke again, which was, I thought, a very good way to be. Beaumont's second letter came in April. He'd filed the challenge. He'd found what he needed in the original warrant paperwork. The clerk who'd signed it had used a designation standard that had been overturned in a federal appeal the previous year. It didn't make the warrant illegal exactly, but it made it voidable with the right argument, and Beaumont had the right argument. He expected a hearing within 60 days. I told Cora at dinner. She put her fork down. She sat very still for a moment. She said 60 days. I said, give or take, Beaumont doesn't overstate. She picked up her fork again, took a bite, set it down again. She said, what happens at the hearing? I said, Beaumont presents the challenge. The federals have to show cause why the warrant should stand. Given the clerk's designation error and the lack of evidence of your knowledge or intent, he believes they won't have sufficient cause. She said, believes. I said, he's not a man who promises what he can't back. She nodded. We ate for a while in silence. The kitchen lamp had the wick trimmed right for once, and the light was steady and warm. She said, August, if this goes the way Beaumont thinks. I said, then the warrant is discharged. You're clear. She said, and if it doesn't? I said, then we look at the next option. There are other arguments. It takes longer. She said, you're not concerned. I said, I'm always concerned. I'm just not discouraged. She looked at me across the table, the lamp between us. Outside, the plains were dark and the wind was still for once. No sound but the house. She said, I keep waiting for you to tell me this is too much trouble, that you'd rather I just moved on. I said, I know you do. She said, why haven't you? I said, because I don't want you to move on. It landed plain. I hadn't dressed it up and I hadn't softened it. It was just the true thing, and I'd gotten old enough that I didn't see the use in arranging true things into something more careful than they were. She looked at me for a long time after that. She said, I don't know what I expected when I came here. I said, what did you find? She said something I didn't think was still possible. She looked down at her plate, then back up at me. I found a man who does what he says he'll do, who doesn't explain himself or apologize for it, who looked at the worst thing about my situation and made it his problem without asking for anything in return. A pause. I've been watching for the angle, the part where I find out what this costs me. I said, there's no angle. She said, I know, that's what I'm telling you. I know there's no angle. And I'm not used to that. I'm not built for trusting it, but I'm trying. I said, that's enough. She said, is it? I said, yes. Beaumont wrote in June. The hearing had gone as he'd expected. The federal examiner had reviewed the warrant and the challenge and had found the designation insufficient. The warrant was voided. Cora Dunst was no longer named in any federal instrument. Hallard Recovery had been formally notified. The matter was closed. I read the letter twice, then a third time, then I folded it and put it in the leather folder. I found her at the horse pen. She was doing what she sometimes did in the evenings, standing at the fence rail, watching the horses move in the last light. Not trying to touch them, not making anything of it, just watching. I stood beside her and handed her the letter. She unfolded it, read it. The light was going orange and low over the western flat. She read it through twice, and then she folded it very carefully, along the same lines it had come in, and held it in both hands. She said, it's done. I said, it's done. She stood there a moment. One of the horses, a gray gelding I'd had 8 years, came to the fence and put his nose toward her hand, which he hadn't done before. She let him. Didn't make a fuss of it, just let him. She said, I owe you $670. I said, you owe me the $420. Beaumont's fees were mine. She turned and looked at me. I said, the warrant was on my property. Beaumont was protecting the Broken Bow's interests as much as yours. I'd have filed that challenge with any employee in your situation. She said, you wouldn't have. I said, no, probably not. I looked at her. It was yours, the challenge was for you. She held that, the horse moved away from the fence. The light was almost gone. She said, I've been thinking, since Beaumont's last letter, about what comes after this. I said, and? She said, I've been thinking that I'd like to stay. I didn't say anything right away. There was nothing that needed to be said right away. She said, not because of what you did, or not only, because I know this land now, I know the books, I know the hands, I know what this place costs and what it earns and what it needs, because I'm good at this. A pause. And because the man who runs it is the kind of man I didn't think existed anymore. I said, what kind is that? She said, the kind who doesn't need to make you small to feel large, who does the hard thing because it's the hard thing and doesn't demand credit for it, who lets you be what you are. I said, Cora. She said, yes. I said, I'd like to ask you something that I'm going to ask plainly, because I don't have a gentle way to ask it, and I don't think you'd want one. She turned to face me fully. The last of the light was behind her. I said, I'd like to ask you to marry me. Not because of what I did for you and not because of what you owe me, because neither of those things is a foundation for anything worth having. I'm asking because you're the best person I've had on this property in 30 years of building it. Because I've watched you work and watched you think and watched you handle hard things without making them harder. Because you have more sense than anyone I know and more patience and more backbone. And because this house is better with you in it than it's ever been without you. I looked at her. That's what I have to offer. The ranch, the work. A man who will do what he says he'll do. I'm not a young man, and I'm not a soft one, and there are harder years ahead than the ones behind, probably. But I will stand by what's mine, and I'd like you to be mine. The wind moved across the flat. Somewhere in the pen behind us, a horse shifted weight. She said, you know I'm not easy. I said I'd be bored inside a week. Something broke across her face then, not quite a smile, more than a smile. A kind of light that doesn't have a proper name. She looked at me the way I'd caught her looking at the land sometimes, like she was memorizing it, like she wanted to keep it. She said, yes. We were married in the front room of the Broken Bow on a Saturday in late August with Hennessy as witness, and a circuit preacher named Fulton who came through twice a year, and who asked no unnecessary questions. Cora wore a gray dress she'd altered herself over the week before. I'd seen her at it in the evenings, lamplight and her hands working with a calm precision that I had come to think of as essentially her, the way some things are. The room had the smell of the beeswax she'd put on the floors, and the bread she'd baked that morning and something else underneath those. The dry, warm smell of the plains coming through the window, the smell of where we were. Fulton said the words. We said what needed to be said. Hennessy sat in his chair by the window with his hands folded on his knee, not seeing well enough to see us but hearing everything, and there was something right about that. After we ate the bread she'd made and some cold beef, and we drank the bottle of good whiskey I'd been keeping since I didn't remember when, saving it for an occasion, and I thought, this is what the occasion was. This. The bread and the whiskey and the preacher gone and Hennessy dozing in his chair, and the light going long and gold through the window. And this woman sitting across the table from me, my wife, with the leather folder on the desk in the next room and the ledger balanced and the warrant voided and everything hard and good ahead. She said, are you going to tell me what's in the good whiskey? I said, 18 years mostly. She said, worth it. I said, yeah. We sat there. The light moved the way it does in late August, slow and orange like it doesn't want to go. Outside, one of the hands was putting up the horses for the night. Ordinary sounds, the Broken Bow settling into evening the same way it always did. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Not reaching for something, not needing anything from it. Just the gesture, her hand flat on the back of mine, warm and still, the way you touch something you're sure of. I turned my hand over, held hers. We didn't say anything else for a while, and there was nothing that needed to be said. The last thing I'll tell you is this. About a month after the wedding, I was out riding the south fence, a thing I do most Saturday mornings, checking the line, making sure the posts are solid after whatever the week's weather has done. The sky was clear and the air had the particular cold of early September. That first cold, the one that makes you remember winter, is a real thing and not a story. I had my coat on and my breath was showing, and the horse moved easy under me, and I was, I suppose, content in the plain way of a man who has made something and can look at it and see that it's still there. I came back over the rise and the house was below me, and there was smoke from the chimney. She'd had the fire going, had probably had it going for an hour already. And there was a lamp in the kitchen window, though the morning was still bright enough that you didn't need one. and I could see her silhouette against it, moving, doing whatever she was doing in there, the ordinary motion of someone at work in their own house. I sat up there on the horse a minute and looked at it. Here is what I know about that moment. I didn't feel soft about it. I didn't feel swept away or thankful in some worked-up way. I felt right, solid, like a thing that had been slightly off balance for a long time had finally found its footing and wasn't going anywhere. She'd chosen this, not because she owed me something, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had the warrant cleared, she could have gone anywhere. She'd chosen the broken bow, and she'd chosen me, plainly and with her eyes open, and she was in my kitchen right now with the lamp lit, and the fire going, and the books probably open on the table beside the bread she'd started, because that was who she was, and she didn't stop being who she was for anyone. I rode down off the rise and put the horse up and went inside. She said, without looking up from the ledger, "South fence holding." I said, "Post down near the creek. I'll get tuck on it Monday." She said, "Coffee's hot." I poured myself a cup, sat down across from her. The fire was warm and the coffee was good, not cold this time, not forgotten on the desk corner while I stared at a number that wouldn't move. Hot, the way coffee is when someone's been paying attention. I drank it. She worked. Outside, the September sky was very blue and very wide, and the broken bow lay under it the same as it always had, and the same as it would.